hosted by the Ames Youth and Schools Action Team, the Anti-Racism Collaborative of Ames, the Ames branch of the NAACP, and the Ames Black Liberation Movement. These groups are nonpartisan, grassroots community organizations run by local volunteers who care deeply about issues of equity, justice, and fairness in the Ames community. They have come together tonight to create a platform for school board candidates to answer specific and in-depth questions related to diversity, equity, and inclusion in Ames community schools. We want to thank the Ames Public Library for providing facilities for groups like this to host forums of community interest and for assisting with the logistics of this event. We'd also like to thank Mark Looney for his help with our live stream. And finally, we would like to thank you, the public, for showing up both in person and online to hear from these candidates. I'm Dr. Angela Prince, and I will be your MC for tonight. Each candidate for the Ames Community School Board was invited to attend tonight's forum. We would like to thank the 5 candidates who chose to attend the forum and provide their perspectives on DEI-related issues in the district. The format of this forum is as follows. That's a lot of F's for someone who's from the South. Yeah, I got it. Each candidate will have 1 minute to give an opening statement. I will then ask the first question. Each host group has selected an individual to ask questions on their behalf. The representatives from the host groups will state their name and the group they're representing before they ask their question. The remaining time will be split between questions submitted from our in-person audience, which should be written on a note card. There's a basket right there that says place questions here, and from our online audience, and questions that were submitted on the Facebook forum page prior to tonight's event. So thanks to everyone who's organizing that. Each candidate will have 90 seconds to respond to questions. We have a timer sitting in the front row. Oh, standing in the back, right there, and a time pacer next to them, so thanks to Kara and Obi for their help, who will hold up cards for the speaker to let them know when they have 30 seconds left, 15 seconds left, and when time is up. A candidate must stop speaking once their time is up, so please conform your answers to the 90-second time limit. All submitted questions not answered during this forum, and there have been some really good ones, I wish we had time to get to all of them, they will be placed on the Facebook forum page. They will also be provided to the candidates to answer as they wish after the forum. We ask that the audience refrain from audibly reacting to candidate responses so that we're able to capture a high-quality recording of this event. I have been notified that the audio online is a little low, so we have allowed or asked the candidates if they would consider removing their mask when they answer questions for clarity's sake. Also, Mr. Rolf Duvik has to leave early, so we wanted to let everyone know that, and thank you for understanding. We're busy people. All right, are you ready to go? Okay, let's begin. Candidates, you have 1 minute to provide an opening statement, and we'll start with Mr. Scott Pryor.
Thank you, and thank you for everyone's time to be here again at another forum here at the Ames Public Library. I appreciate your time. There's probably not, in terms of our schools, a more important election that's going to take place on November 2nd. There's a lot of issues and that we're going to need to address as a school board. And what I think I bring to the table with that school board is 28 years of experience in education. And when we start to tackle some of these issues, I think it's going to be important to have somebody that has worked inside the walls of the school and kind of knows the ebb and flow of a school day or even a school year or a specific grade level. So that's why I'm running. To be honest with you, if there were no seats available, I'm not sure I would have run. But there were, and I believe my experience will lend itself to the betterment of the school board and to continuous school improvement here in Ames.
Good evening. My name is Amy Smith, and I'm a mom of 2 kids in the district, as well as an ISU professor and a dedicated community member. I'm here tonight to ask all of you for your vote. I'm running for the Ames Community School Board because our kids and our families have had a hard few years. And at this moment, we need somebody who will stand up for equity and diversity and inclusion on the Ames Community School Board. So here's what I bring to tonight's conversation. As a social scientist, I'm trained to analyze data, and I have done a lot of research on disparities in both the United States and in Latin America. As a community member, I have a long history of service to low-income and immigrant communities, both in Ames and across the United States. I still have a lot to learn. I'm looking forward to learning from all of you tonight. I want each of you to keep pushing me to get better, to do better. This is something that all of us need to get better at as a community. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Rolf Dubik. I've lived in Ames for 37 years. My wife Amy and I have raised 6 children to adulthood, all of them Ames high school graduates. And we also have a 7th child who's in 2nd grade. Also have 2 granddaughters who will be entering the school system in a few short years. I'm not just running for my kids and my grandkids, but I really do care about every single child that walks those halls. And I think it's critical for them to be able to thrive, to have an environment, not just for the children, but for the teachers as well, that's structured and disciplined so that they can thrive in their pursuit of good education.
All right, thank you everyone for coming tonight, for our host, for putting on this event. I'm Kelly Winfrey. I'm a professor of journalism and communication at Iowa State. My research, teaching, service, and outreach have largely focused on representation, equity, inclusion, and diversity. Personally, I've made it a priority to learn more about inequitable and unjust systems and try to help change those systems. So I'm running for school board. When it comes to education, I know that diversity, equity, and inclusion are at the heart of so many of the challenges that we face in the district. We can't address test scores without understanding how systems create disparities between groups. We can't address climate or behavior without examining how policies contribute to those problems. And we can't address staff shortages or retention without ensuring we have a district that is inclusive and supportive. As a board member, my work will be grounded in these principles, and I thank you for being here tonight and ask for your vote. Thank you.
Equity is indispensable in the public school system. It should be a required course for all teachers, students, administrators, parents, and board members. I am Brett Becker. I'm running for a seat on the Ames Community School Board because I believe in education, a broad-based, equitable, and complete education. Broader is better. I hail from a family of educators. My grandmother, uncle, mom, and dad, wife, and daughter, all teachers. And for 30 years, as an ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church USA, I have taught and preached about equity, inclusivity, diversity. The fact that a number of our school members, our school board candidates, are not here tonight, and the fact that this room is not nearly as crowded as it was last week for the forum, seems to indicate that equity is optional. It's not. It is a mandate. It is important.
Right, thank you so much and welcome tonight. So this is our first question. What is your definition of educational equity? So Dr. Smith, I think we'll begin with you.
Thank you, Angela. Can you, yeah, okay. Equity refers to the idea that every single child gets what they need to be able to achieve their full potential. So different children need different things. Some kids are going to need supports, mental health supports, or other kinds of supports that other children simply aren't going to need. Equity should be the foundation of much of what we are doing in the schools. Equity is not a single topic that we study one day of the week. Equity is not a week devoted to any particular identity group. Equity is the way we need to be thinking about everything we are doing within the school system. It needs to happen from July 1st to June 30th, all year round. Equity must be the foundation of the way we think about the schools. Thank you.
Can you repeat the question again real quick?
Absolutely. No problem. So what is your definition of educational equity?
That's a very good question, and I've asked it many times to different people. It sounds very good on its face, but I've yet to find two people who are able to define equity and how it's applied. In some ways, it seems nebulous. I guess I am of the opinion, and I'm sorry I'm not watching the time, but yeah, I think what is most important if we're talking about equality, equity, every student is important, and we need to provide a structured, safe, disciplined environment so that every student can pursue the education that they desire. And what obstacles are in the way, we need to deal with those, but they need to be identified and dealt with at that time.
Well, Ralph, I'll give you two people with just about the same definition, because I'm going to second most of what Amy Erica said. And that equity is when all students have what they need to reach their potential. This is something that I have personally studied and researched professionally. And I think it's apparent in the school district, if you look at things like test scores and other outcomes, that there are disparities based on different identity groups. If we want to improve equity, we need to focus on systems, not on individuals. So that's one of the really important parts of understanding how we address inequities, is not to say we need to focus on this student or that student, but what about the system itself is making these disparities happen. So as a board member, I would take that definition of equity and do research to identify what things are causing that. And the district's already started this work. They've done a lot of research already to identify ways that we can improve. And I hope that expertise is something that I can bring to the board.
One of my fellow candidates, One of my fellow candidates just equated equality with equity. They're different. I recently saw a good illustration of this. Imagine three people at the outside of a fence trying to watch a baseball game. Equality is, and one person's tall, one person's medium-sized, and one person's shorter. Equality is that they're all standing on the same size box. One of them is way above the fence. One of them can see well. The other one is still looking into the fence. Equity has the tall person not needing a box to stand on. They're fine. They can see the game. The medium-sized person, again, has the size box so that they can see over the fence. And the shorter person has a much taller box so that they can stand on it. That's equity. That all are given the opportunity to reach the goal. It's not the same product that we give them, the same information, and the same treatment. As Kelly has just shared, I agree, it's not just individuals. It's also the system that we're in that produces that inequity that sometimes we don't even understand that somebody needs more to be able to succeed. We think, let's give everybody the same thing. That doesn't do it, because we come from different backgrounds, different experiences, different inequalities in our life, different understandings of our existence. So let's commit ourselves to equity, and that's hard work, because we have to consider each individual and the system in which we all find ourselves.
Well, first and foremost, equity is not nebulous. Equity is the foundation by which we do what we do in education. And it is about individual students. And it is about figuring out what individual students need. Are there groups of individual students that need the same thing? Certainly. Are there larger groups that need same things? Certainly. There are also individuals that need certain things, and that needs to be attacked every day. And I'm well aware that because of my experience in education, I'm at an advantage when we talk about some of these things in terms of knowing what goes on behind those walls. But when we look at equity, it's got to be the foundation of everything that we do, or we don't have education. It's not possible without it. Because by that very definition, everybody is getting educated. Not just some people, not just a majority, everybody is getting educated. And when you put these plans in, and when you're working with individual kids, and you make these decisions, it's not always easy to turn on a dime. I've heard a board member that I really respect talk a lot about some of our brown and black students that she could literally put her arms around. It's that few that need some attention. We need to start giving that attention, and we need to start coming up with plans for those kids to make those improvements.
All right, thank you. Ms. Edna, I think you're up.
Good evening, and thank you for taking the time to attend tonight. I am Edna Young Clinton, the current president of the Ames branch of the NAACP. And the question for the candidates tonight: where do you stand on House File 802, often referred to as the ban on teaching and training related to divisive concepts?
Thank you for the question.
Thank you.
I think House File 802 relates somewhat directly to the idea of critical race theory. And it's considered divisive by many. In fact, nationwide, roughly 80% are opposed to that being in the schools. When we start putting people in categories, and let me give an illustration. I had the fortune of playing professional football for a very brief time. It's something that most people don't get to do. However, that didn't define who I was. We are a diverse community in so many ways, and that needs to be appreciated. But those characteristics shouldn't necessarily define us and limit us. And I think House File is something that they're trying to prohibit happening. Thank you.
I am adamantly opposed to House File 802, and it's one of the reasons I decided to run for school board. The bill itself mischaracterizes what's being taught in classrooms about race, about systemic oppression, about privilege. There's a mischaracterization of what critical race theory is, and I don't have the time to explain that when I'm probably not even the best person, but I guarantee you we're not teaching critical race theory that we're teaching in Iowa State in my pre-K class. That's not what's happening. What the impact of this bill, though, is to cause a chilling effect on teachers so that they won't teach anything that might inform us about diversity and inclusion. So now we have teachers and administrators who would like to continue doing this education who are afraid of losing their jobs or facing a lawsuit. I want to be a board member that encourages our administrators and our teachers to continue that work and to know that I have their back, and I will do everything I can to make sure that they are able to continue doing that. Now, the law is poorly written. It would not stand up to most legal challenges. I am very confident of that. I also expect it to be challenged anyway. But the law is flawed in so many ways. And I think it's very important that we not back down because a few people who honestly don't even know what they're talking about want to stop a conversation.
House File 802 misunderstands the word divisive. To teach about our country's history and the unequal outcomes that it has led to for people of color in this country is not divisive. That's information. That's important for us as part of our education to understand how to move forward. We don't have to feel guilty about something that happened in the past, but we are responsible to relate it today and how those outcomes are disproportionately impacting people of color. We have to face that and act on it if we wish to go forward. Institutional racism is what critical race theory is talking about. Institutional racism is a form of discrimination whereby our legal system, some of our structures, lead us to not treat people equally. And the outcomes are different for the different groups of people and races of people. That's so important. Unequal outcomes are the key. I'm against House File 802. I'm in favor of a broad-based education that needs to be spread out amongst our teachers. We should be able to teach so that students of all ages, K through 12 and even below, understand that when people are treated differently, we need to understand how they need to be treated better today. Thank you.
I think Dr. Anthony Jones did a great job of talking about House File 802 at probably 2 or 3 board meetings ago. And a lot of the same discussion and same points were brought up, people not in favor of House File 802, and he was very positive and said, if you really read it, and I don't encourage you to do so because it's a long document, it's really boring. But if you really read it, what it's saying is, you can't teach anything where you're going to say, as an outcome, a group of people can never change. And I liked his perspective on that, because it's not saying we can't teach what actually took place. Why wouldn't we? That is history. Why wouldn't we have those diverse conversations? Why wouldn't we get a student's perspective who has their lineage back 100 years and have them share that with the rest of our students? Of course we should do that. That's why it's called education. We need these robust discussions so that our students can learn from all of our history, not just from a history or a line. I also believe in local control. I don't think we need legislators telling us what we need to do in Ames, Iowa with our education, because we don't need the same thing that Colo needs, and that Nevada needs, and that maybe Iowa City or West Des Moines Valley needs. We need what Ames needs, and we need local control. Thank you.
Yes, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry, sorry.
Do you
Okay.
need the question reread?
No, I'm fine. No, I'm sorry. I thought you were stepping down because I was done.
No.
Okay. All right. Yeah, so thank you. So where do I stand on House File 802? If I were a legislator, I would not have voted for this piece of legislation. I don't like it. That said, it is a piece of legislation. So what do we do with the fact that that this piece of legislation has been created? It's a shoddy piece of legislation, to be really honest. First of all, it mischaracterizes what happens in the schools. It bans things like saying that one race is better than another, which is not something I've ever heard a teacher say in any situation. It creates a straw man out of what's happening in the classroom in order to basically demonize certain kinds of education in order to make people opposed to that kind of education. So it creates a straw man, it misrepresents what's happening in the classroom. It also doesn't have an enforcement mechanism, and it's also not clear that it's enforceable in schools in particular. So there are lots of problems with the legislation. With that said, it leaves lots of latitude for talking about equity and diversity and inclusion in the classroom. doesn't actually affect most of the teaching that we can do about equity and diversity and inclusion in the classroom. We need to continue to talk about these issues in the classroom. This is how we progress as a society. This is not divisive. This is how we come together as a community and learn how to get better. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Jessica Sidler, and I am representative of the group of ARC of Ames, the Anti-Racism Collaborative. Our question is, to what do you attribute the academic disparities documented within the Ames Community School District? And we'll start with Kelly.
Wow, that one to go first on. Thank you for the question. I think that it's pretty clear that from what we know about research and education, that inequities like that, inequities that are based on race, on socioeconomic status, mean there's something wrong with the institution. And there's something wrong with the way that we're doing our schools. I think that we have a lot of teachers and administrators that want to do good. I think that we need to continue working and supporting teachers and administrators as they continue things like critical consciousness training, as they work to develop curriculum that is inclusive and representative and engaging. And I think another big part is climate. If students don't feel safe and welcome in the classroom, it's very difficult to learn. So we need to create an environment where all of our students are able to learn in our school buildings.
Learning disparities occur when students don't feel like the curriculum that's being taught is representative of them. We need to provide in our curriculum diverse voices so that students in the minorities or students who are sidelined will begin to understand that they too are represented in the curriculum. You know, students can be outside on the playground at their school, they can be at the passing time, they can be at lunch breaks, they can be completely engaged in conversations and in relationships while they're there, but they get into the classroom sometimes and they just sink back into their chair and they disconnect. And that's largely because they don't see themselves represented in what is being taught in our history and social studies courses. So we need to bring in diverse voices in that curriculum. We need to have images where students see themselves so that they can then say, that's me. But the times, oftentimes, when our students of color see themselves in our curriculum, it's negative images. It's images of oppression or images of slavery. We need to provide other images as well so that they can see themselves in what we do and imagine themselves moving forward. If we can do that, I believe the learning disparities will lessen and we will continue to move up and improve our scores and our achievements and the social, emotional learning that's necessary in the schools.
If we had the data sitting in front of us right now of students that aren't having success at Ames at any of the schools, we would quickly find, in looking at that data, that there's a lot of different reasons. But if we're talking for, say, 90 seconds about the topic, we have to look at it and say, okay, what's something we can do that we know is going to make a difference? And that's culture and climate, and that's relationships. Because if you show me a classroom, whether it's a third grade classroom, a government classroom in the high school, or a middle school science classroom, where the teacher has good relationships with the kids, and they're using those examples like Brett mentioned down there that makes sense to the different students because they have enough awareness to know I don't just have one type of student in my classroom. Then I'll show you a successful classroom. Our teachers, our administrators, they need to have the tools to know how to form good and positive relationships. And I think by and large they do at Ames. I really do. Can it get better? Always. Schools are always improving. But those relationships and that culture and that climate builds everything. Because when we talk about some of the videos we've all seen, where maybe there's some violence, if there's a relationship there, you don't get to that level. Doesn't mean you're not going to have an argument. Doesn't mean you're not going to get upset as a high school student. Maybe even raise your voice. Maybe even speak inappropriately. But not get to that other level if you have that right culture and that climate and those right relationships. Thank you.
This is a great question and so important for understanding how we address equity. So we can think about the roots of the equity, the disparities that we see in our schools in terms of what happened outside of school and what's happening in the school. In terms of what's happening outside the school, I could give you guys several lectures, maybe an entire course on what has happened outside of schools to get to this point. It involves histories of poverty, racism, exclusion, all kinds of things that are going on outside the schools. The schools can't address all of those issues. What the schools can address is what's happening inside the schools, which is not going to fix all of those issues overnight, but there are lots and lots of things we can do looking at what we have inside the school that can make things better. So yes, a diverse curriculum, absolutely. Many of the things that other people have said already, a diverse curriculum can help. Certainly creating a positive, inclusive culture can help. But we're also going to need to focus on supports that meet children where they are. So we have a problem right now in our district with hiring educational assistants because of certain hiring practices, we need to hire more educational assistants. We need more counselors, we need social workers. We need people who are able to meet kids where they are and help them to get to where they need to be going. And if we do this, we can address many of these issues. Thank you.
Many of the things that we are faced with encountering in our school system really has to go to a lack of structure and discipline. I said last week that when we had our 7th child, she came to us somewhat broken. And what was really important for us to realize early on was that she needed routine, structure, a disciplined environment, because that gave her security. And without that, she was not able to learn up to her capabilities. She wasn't able to thrive. It's really no different in the school system. And we have kids in the community that maybe come from unstable homes for various reasons. And the school can be a place of refuge, of a sense of security. And kids really do want to learn. But with all the disruptions that we allow because of the lack of structure and discipline, there's a lot of kids being disenfranchised.
Good evening. My name is Martin Stennis Jr. I'm a representative of the Black Liberation Movement. Our question is, I sort of answered it already. Do you believe that systemic racism exists, and of course should be involved in educating our youth so that they don't replicate any of the past disparities that are currently in our midst in the United States?
Systemic racism absolutely exists. It exists in our culture, it exists in our institutions, and oftentimes in our minds, and we don't even recognize it. There are implicit bias tests that we can take. I mean, I encourage people to go to harvard.edu and look at these implicit bias tests. They're not just bias, they're not just tests to look at bias by race, they're tests that look at bias by body type, by gender. And they ask questions so that we can examine in ourselves where we may have blind spots. We all have something to learn. We all have issues where we're not quite seeing things correctly and clearly. Our education should address those issues and help all of our students from the youngest age to say, how am I looking at this other person? And is it different than I'm looking at myself? Now, having said that, We can't be colorblind. Sometimes we use that term, well, I'm colorblind. I don't see any races, I don't see any colors. That's not good. We need to recognize the differences in one another to understand the different backgrounds, different experiences that we've had. Then when we do, we can find a way to connect and to relate. So it's not about being colorblind. It's about being color aware, gender aware, body type aware, whatever our biases are, to know that sometimes we treat people differently based on their characteristics. If we can include those teachings against those kind of things in our schools and enable our children to enlarge and broaden their viewpoint at the youngest ages, then we wouldn't have some of the problems we have in our culture today with adults.
I would agree. Systemic racism is present, is prevalent. And the only way we're going to get beyond that is education. And I do believe it's always been interesting to me as an adult working in education when you deal with kids and how they view certain things and how they can love unconditionally and can like unconditionally, which also is a hard thing to do sometimes. But us adults kind of struggle with that, and I don't know when we lose that. If I knew, I would write a book and make a lot of money, maybe, I don't know. But we lose that at some point. In education, we need to have these robust discussions. We need to know where our neighbor's from and what their reality is. Because I'll never forget talking to a student who had moved in from Illinois, and we were talking, and I said, explain to me your background and your fear. He couldn't believe that our police officer came through the school a couple times a day, mostly just to say hi to kids and stuff like that. Couldn't believe that that was happening. I said, well, give me your experience. And he just simply said, Mr. Dreyer, have you ever been pulled over by law enforcement and wondered if you maybe were going to get shot or die? No. Never in my life have I been pulled over and wondered about that. And that's the perspective, I think, that we need to share, and our students need to share, and the learning that needs to happen. Just one example.
Yes, systemic racism exists. So what is systemic racism? Systemic racism is not about individuals. The notion is that the long history of the United States, the history that includes a history of slavery, that includes a history of conquest of much of the territory of the United States, has led to institutions, has led to processes that have created inequitable outcomes. The aftermath of all of these processes have led to inequitable outcomes. And also, there are individual biases as well in the system. But we need to look at systems. So yes, systemic racism exists and it is affecting how things happen in our schools. We're not going to address we're not going to fix U.S. history, U.S. history has great things about it too, but we're not going to address every issue in our schools. What we're going to be able to do is through all of the strategies that we've been talking about, there are lots of things we can do to address the issues that we face currently in our schools. It's going to take courage. It's going to take concern for our kids. And it's absolutely essential that we do it. Thank you.
First of all, I want to thank everyone for indulging me. I can't be here beyond this question. I'll wait for all of it to be completed. But thank you for inviting me. I had a previous engagement that I need to attend, and so I'll be leaving after this question. So thank you. What I think is really important is that we protect our children's innocence. Unless something is very clear and evident, we need to address that and those issues. Vodi Bakum says that institutional racism is racism without to, and that's what he says. It's racism without a racist. But what we find ourselves doing is we're looking for something that may not be there, to the point where we've lost our purpose for existing as a public school system. And that is to educate each child to be proficient in those core subjects. Time's up. Thank you.
Rolf, thank you for coming, since you're about to leave. But thank you for the question. Systemic racism is real. That's, I think, something that isn't surprising for me to say. I think that one of the ways that we can help people understand this issue is through more education, and that includes in our schools. There are so many things that I didn't learn or didn't even have to think about as a white person growing up in the suburbs of Kansas City. There was so much bias that I absorbed and wasn't aware of until I talked to the right people, until I read the right books, until I got the right education. Not everyone has access to that, or not everyone knows where to find it or is seeking it out. That is why we have to talk about the realities of our world in our schools. I don't think it's protecting innocence, because I think that it is telling the truth. And the other thing is it's only protecting the innocence of the white students in the classroom, right? Because they don't have to observe it. It's a matter of making you aware. I also think that one of the opportunities that we have as a school board, and I know that there was some initial efforts to do this that I'd like to see continued, is to reach out to parents and to community members to bring them along in this educational process. Because like I said, I happened into learning these things through my life experiences. It is not surprising that a lot of our parents are not educated on this topic. Why would they be? They didn't learn it in school. So let's try to include them in those conversations too.
Hello, my name is Jenny Coffey, and I am here representing the Ames Youth and Schools Action Team. I'll give you a moment, please. No, you're fine. Thank you. And our question for you is, how do you balance the use of evidence-based practices with community feedback asking for actions that are not supported by research literature? Who's first on this?
Okay, no, I don't think it is, but
Pretty sure it's not.
if it's not yet, I feel like it's usually my fault.
I wish it was you. I'm sorry, can you ask that one more time?
How do you balance the use of evidence-based practices with community feedback asking for actions that are not supported by research literature?
Sure. First of all, research-based strategies and teaching strategies are a good thing. Things that are backed by research that we use in the classroom every day. That's fantastic. But we can't ignore the here and now. And there's going to be things that come up where we say, well, there's no research behind that. And here in the time of COVID, I can give you a million examples where we don't have as much research as we'd like to have, but we have to make a decision here. I talked to a really, really nice family over in the Duff area about something similar to this, about getting curriculum out there, and I asked them, what did you think about during the Black Lives Matter curriculum coming out? What are your thoughts on that? We had a really nice discussion about, it kind of came out quickly. Don't know if all of the teachers or all the administrators had the same training, but my children had a great experience. That's something that doesn't have a lot of evidence behind it, right? It just hasn't been around long enough. Now, are there pieces of that curriculum that are rooted heavily in best practice? Certainly there are. But as a package, probably not. So we should ignore that, and we should not expose our children to some of this information and some of this curriculum because, well, you know, there's not a lot of data behind it right now. Sometimes we have to trust, and sometimes we have to say, this is a unique opportunity. Thank you.
Okay, so I think the way I interpret the question is as being about what do you do when what the community wants conflicts with what research says. I think that's the question. So, how do you deal with this? First of all, I am an academic. I'm trained to look at data and read data and base decisions on data. And I care a lot about research. So I will be following scientific evidence. For instance, I have committed to following the CDC guidelines. At the same time, it's also really important for members of the community to feel heard and listened to and included within the community. So how do we balance these two things? So there's a lot of political science research that shows that a lot of the polarization that we have right now in the United States is not really about issues so much as it is about people's sort of fundamental sense of identity, their feeling that they're personally included. And a lot of our tribalism is about, like, I think that group doesn't like people like me. So I think a lot of what we need is for people to feel respected. When everybody feels respected, people are more likely to feel heard and included, even if they don't always get their way on any one particular issue where their views conflict with science. Thank you.
Also, as a researcher, as a social scientist, I conduct studies. I usually have a hypothesis about what's going to happen, and sometimes it's wrong. And I draw conclusions based on that study. Now, that doesn't mean I stop researching. It doesn't mean it's over. It means that you keep asking questions and you look at things from different angles to better understand why you were wrong and what new you can learn. When it comes to making decisions based on evidence versus what the community wants, I think that you have to look first to evidence and to what the data say. I think you can also explain to individuals what that data means, what it means for them and their child, so that that can mean something more than something abstract to them. I think transparent decision-making processes is also helpful, so that people know what data you used, how you collaborated, what questions you asked, and how you got to your conclusions. So I think part of that is making sure people are knowing when the school board's talking about something like that. I think it seems like a lot of times folks know after the fact, right? So we need to make sure people are kind of in the loop about what's going on and are reading their newsletters that they're getting by email. But I also think it's important to listen to community members and much like what Amy Erica said, make sure that they feel heard and know they're heard, and that you will do more research for them and work for them.
I agree. Too often today we're talking past each other as individuals, past each other as groups or clans or political parties. We don't seem to be interested in really hearing what each other have to say. Sometimes we're just interested in winning or knowing if our side's going to win. That doesn't work in education. So we do need to take the time to actually understand what another person's saying. There's a process with kids that has been used recently. It came out of Yale. It's called the ruler system. It's an acrostic. And in their emotions, they need to recognize what their emotions are and what the emotions are of the person across from them. First to recognize, and then to understand what those are, to ask questions so that we actually understand one another, to label what those emotions are. Am I angry? Am I upset? Am I disappointed? Am I hurt? We need to do that as adults too. What is this person really feeling? And then to express those emotions, because if we don't express them, then they're going to be held in. They're going to come out in some other way, and sometimes those aren't healthy ways. And finally, we need to regulate what those emotions are. So right now, I'm excited about this issue. I'm passionate about it, but I'm not yelling. I'm regulating my emotions so that we can understand one another, so that we can talk. That's important. Now, having said all that, we need to base our decisions based on data. There's things that have been studied and understood. I've shared with another forum that I'm a chess player by avocation. And there's a statement in our culture that says, don't just sit there, do something. But I say the opposite. Don't just do something, sit there. Look at the issue, study the issue, and learn what it is before you make that decision.
Thank you so much for our volunteers who are representing these organizations and for your time and expertise. All right. Y'all are doing great. So we have so many great questions. We try to kind of combine some and hopefully cover as many underrepresented groups as possible in the following questions. I'm going to throw a little quick one to you, so our timer people in the back. This is just a yes or no. So 30 seconds or less. I don't think it takes that long for a yes or no, but just in case.
I appreciate that.
30 seconds right in the back. So the first one is, if elected, would you vote to continue the Black Liberation Movement Action Week at School, or BLM Action Week at School? Amy, Erica, I think we're starting with you.
Yes. Yes.
Yes, it will continue and refine it. Yes, yes, yes.
Absolutely.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. All right, so our next question comes from the online platform in advance. It's a little long, but I think you'll get the gist of it. And because your response was a brief, we'll get you to go again. Maybe we'll reinforce your positive behavior. Let's not get technical. All right, so this one is about inclusive efforts. My first grader is a type 1 diabetic. Like 3 of her other siblings, she is on an IEP, an individualized education program, so she's receiving special education services, due to needing additional help. Throughout the pandemic, people that do not value her life have refused to utilize masks near her, argued she and her siblings should stay home all the time instead of going to school, or that as long as she wears a mask, that should be good enough, even though it would mean others couldn't play with her. So with her having a 10 to 15% more likelihood of death than other children from the COVID virus, social distancing and the mask mandate are the best known strategies to keep her safe. So I guess this is kind of getting down to, do you agree with the mask mandate and that one should be in place? And if not, or in addition to, what specific strategies would you recommend to keep her safe and her classmates and her siblings from the risk of bringing the virus home?
So first of all, yes, I agree. I support universal masking at present. I support it under CDC guidelines when CDC guidelines change, and I will support removing them. More broadly, how should we be supporting children with disabilities in our schools in the context of COVID? I think that's the real question. And the answer is that many children with disabilities can't access their education without universal masking, and this is one of the most important reasons that we need universal masking, is to be able to comply with the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And this is the basis on which we currently have the ability to return to universal masking in the schools. So yes, we need universal masking, and we need it to be able to comply with IDEA. At the same time, there are also children with disabilities who have a hard time with masks. This is not a conflict. These things are not in conflict. It is possible to have universal masking to support our children with disabilities, and also to allow children who are not able to wear masks because of usually developmental disabilities or some other kind of disability, to have accommodations. We have accommodations for all kinds of things in the schools, and children with disabilities who can't wear masks, autistic children, children with Down syndrome, and other issues have the right to accommodations under IDEA. Thank you.
Yes, I think this is one of the things that honestly made me so angry about the mask debate, is that public schools are for the public and should be accessible for all students. And that's ultimately how the court decided, what Amy Erica was just explaining. Public schools, and what the job of the school board is to do what's best for the students as a whole. And that means requiring masks, maybe with accommodations under certain circumstances, but so that all students are able to get the education they need and stay safe. It's just that simple. honestly, I get very angry about this one. Because, it's so crazy to me that we would risk children's lives. And I know that a lot of that has to do with misinformation that people might have about masks or the science of COVID. And we need to clearly communicate that. But this is why we have a school board, is to say, look, this is what we got to do for everybody. Frankly, when I heard our governor say that if you needed a mask, that you could just stay home, I was furious. Because, look, that's not optional for those kids, right? That's not an option. They're risking their lives by being there. It is an option if you don't want to wear a mask to stay home, right? So there is a level of personal choice that is still there, but as a public school district, we have to do what's best for students as a whole.
You regulated your strong emotions very well there. Every child needs to be served. We're not talking about private schools where people have their choice. We're talking about public schools where the children need to be served and educated. I'm a word person, and I've already talked about the word divisive. I've talked about the difference between equality and equity. At the previous forum, I mentioned the word responsibility. If we have the responsibility to serve our entire community, then we need to put a mask on if anybody is going to be endangered and their health is at issue. You take that word responsibility, you break it in half, you flip it around, it means the ability to respond. Do I have the ability to respond in a certain situation? If I do, then I'm responsible to do something. It might be inconvenient for me, it might be not something that I want to do, put on the mask, it's uncomfortable, it fogs up my glasses when I talk. But that person's life, is it even a question about how much more important that is than my convenience? So if we are able to respond, we need to, so that every child's life and every child's health is considered. Let's be responsible as adults to one another, and let's remember that the people's lives that we consider may at some time have to consider ours as well. And so it goes both ways.
Yeah, the principal side of me, the first thing I thought was, and first and foremost, whoever wrote the question, I'm sorry that you had to deal with that. The first thing I thought was, get a 504 plan written. And that is the law. When the 504 plan is written, with the team sitting there, which includes the parents and the child, that is law. And if that plan says, she has an immune situation here, everybody has to wear a mask in the room, or whatever face covering you develop because of accommodations for some other folks that maybe can't wear a mask directly over their face, then that's done, and that's done every day. Our teachers do a great job. They're not independent contractors. We have laws we need to follow. We need to take care of our students. I can't imagine sitting in a 504 meeting across from that child and having somebody say, well, it's my right. Are you serious? I mean, this is exactly what Brett just said. We're talking about a life or death situation here. I hate wearing this mask. I can't stand it. And it does give me a little bit of a rash. I put a little medicine on it, I'm good. But if we've got a little girl, a little boy, who has a situation where if they happen to catch something, it's not going to be a good situation, then those two things don't weigh out. And I don't think there's any human being that can argue that. So again, the 504, use the tools that are in the district.
Thank you. So this one is more along the lines of policies. So if you could speak to some policies. This is the question. What policies would you put in place to support LGBTQIA+ students and to protect them against bullying? So Dr. Winfrey, I think it's your turn to start.
Yeah, I think in terms of policies, I think mostly about kind of like disciplinary policies, like you said with anti-bullying. I think that we need to consistently or regularly evaluate whether or not our anti-bullying and harassment policies are effective. I also think that in terms of policy, we should make sure we have an inclusive curriculum. I think that we also need to make sure that we have inclusive programming. You know, and I don't know if we even have these anymore, but to be honest, but I remember like father-daughter dances, right? I actually think my in-laws had one recently, so somebody has them. But these sort of expectations of what a family unit looks like need to be torn apart, right? Because families can look all sorts of different ways. And that's something that we need to go back and look at our policies, our practices, our events, our education, our sex education, and our staff training to make sure people are able to see that everyone is included.
I couldn't agree. There we go. Try it again. I couldn't agree more about the curriculum, about the teachings that we provide for our students. Part of the Black Lives Matter School Week of Action did deal with, and the wording was to dismantle the previous understanding of the nuclear family. And people have taken that as a negative. It's simply to say that that's not the only model anymore that we should be teaching, if it ever was the model that we were only teaching. But there are all kinds of family models today. So somebody with two moms, somebody with two fathers, somebody with one mom or one dad. You know, my parents divorced when I was 6 years old, and I had that experience of a father-son event that my dad wasn't there. Now, it's a minor example compared to what our LGBTQIA+ students have to undergo, or the racial discrimination that takes place in our schools. But it was a small way for me to realize, you know what, if I'm not feeling represented in this activity, then I'm left out, and it begins to separate me. And over time, if that continues to happen, it didn't with me so much, that's a small issue. But with others, it does. It goes on. And that feeling of feeling apart continues. My time's out, but I'll talk more later if I can.
I get tired of the rhetoric that that's not a school issue. Kids are with us in the schools 8 hours a day if you're not in any activities. 75 to 80% of kids are in one or more activities. If you're in 2 activities, you're probably inside the building or on the grounds for 10 to 12 hours a day. I'm not saying that the schools are raising our kids. We as parents and adults, our churches, other entities, have influence on our students. Nobody spends the time with your kids that educators do. And if we're not doing everything we can to make sure that all of our children have access to what they need to be a successful student, then we're missing the boat. Ames has clubs, because we're talking about a certain population of kids, LGBTQ. So they have some clubs. Of course they should have some clubs. Of course they should have some organizations. Of course we should support them in going down to the Capitol on certain days. We should support and embrace these things. In terms of bullying, it needs to be taken care of swiftly. There needs to be consistent consequences, and it needs to be across the board. I can tell you, in my 10 years at my last stop as principal, my first 3 years, this was the plan, was bullying needs to be addressed. I was told that in the interview, and that my job depended on it. We set a culture and a climate so that students were able to come and turn these things in, and we made sure we had a swift and a consistent consequence for that. Very important. I'm sorry. Thank you.
Brett, you have 30 more seconds. I apologize.
Well, that's what I thought. It seemed like start now. There is an anti-bullying app that a lot of parents aren't aware of. As I've gone door to door, I've told people, and they said, I didn't know that was even out there. It's called Anonymous Alerts. And you can find that, and that is a way for students and parents to anonymously report cyberbullying, bullying, and other personal issues that may come up. Because the fact is that most bullying that doesn't result in injury is not reported. Because students are afraid if they report something, they'll be retaliated against again. So let's make sure that we support those who are experiencing that. Got it, thank you.
I'm so glad you got your extra time, Brett. Okay. First of all, I want to say that this is such an important topic for me on a personal level. I have personally seen in my own life with queer kids whom I have been involved with how the lack of an inclusive environment in schools can have really, really hard impacts on children. You can't succeed in school if you don't feel safe and included. So our children need to feel like school is a place where they have access to the supports they need to succeed. So how do we do this? What are the policies? First, everything that we have said about creating policies to create a culture of inclusion, which means we need to talk about how we treat each other in our schools. It needs to be affirmatively taught that we treat each other well. This also involves consequences for bullying. We need systems to report, as people have said, and we need clear, consistently implemented consequences that are implemented quickly in order to address these issues. We also need a curriculum where children see themselves. That helps children feel included, and it also helps other children come to accept the great diversity of the experiences of their peers, both the peers' family and the peers' lives themselves. We also should be teaching about historical processes of marginalization in the schools in order for children to understand how these things happen. Thank you.
All right, so this next question is along the topic of teacher and administrator support. So we have a question that came online and one from in the room that are pretty similar, so I'm going to try to combine these. But how will you support teachers and administrators who are being targeted for doing equity work? So this targeting we know came through like the Iowa Legislature House Government Oversight Committee, where some of our administrators had to go and face 2 hours of questioning, but it's also been in the form of licensure complaints to the Board of Education, examiners, public slander, hateful emails, et cetera, et cetera. So I think Dr. Becker, it's your turn to start.
We absolutely have to have our teachers' backs. There's no getting around that. As coming from a family of teachers, as I shared in my opening statement, I see how teachers are underappreciated to start with. Unless you're in that classroom, it's very difficult to know the challenges that face those who educate our children on an everyday basis. And then to add to that, these attacks that are being made because they're attempting to be inclusive and attempting to teach history to our youngest ones that will broaden them and enable them to be better people. I can't say what I would actually do to a person who does that bullying, but I would say that for the teachers, we need to come alongside them as a school board and say, we support you in all situations. Whatever you need to get through the day, whatever you need in supports emotionally and socially, physically, we will provide that for you. And we'll make policies if we have to change how people interact with you so that you'll feel that you can teach and you can teach fully to the students that are under your charge.
The number one impact on education is teachers. They're the number one impact. Followed very closely, number two, by building principals. And some people have argued that building principals should probably be number one, because if it's not going well with your building principal, then things aren't going well with you. So through osmosis there, if I've used the right term, it's the principal. Having said that, during my 20 years as a high school principal, I don't think I ever did better work for kids or for teachers than in times when I knew my school board supported me. I don't think I ever did better work. I don't think my teachers ever did better work than when they felt like Scott supports me. He tells me he supports me, he shows me, he models it, he defends me, and that's what needs to happen in any good school district, not just Ames. If you got a chance to see the videotape of that mockery that took place down in Des Moines when they brought some of the Ames administration down there, it was a joke. And it was an embarrassment to our state, the way they were treated and the way they were. I don't mind having a discussion. I didn't mind that discussion. The way they were treated and the way those other adults, those legislators, treated our administration should make us all very upset, and we should speak with our votes to that, probably.
So how are we going to protect or support our teachers and parents who are being targeted for equity work? I think the number one most important thing we need to do is to make it clear that the school board and administration are unequivocally on board with this. Now, I'm running to be a school board member, which means that then I'm going to be targeted. But what it means in part is that we are all involved in this. So collaborative leadership is going to be critical here. Leadership that makes it clear that this is a program that we're all on. That means that we talk with each other about how we're going to do things, and we have a program going forward. The Black Lives Matter Week of Action in Schools was an important thing, an important initiative for us to start. There are also things that we can do better next time. There are always things you can do better next time, anytime you implement a new curriculum. Some of the things that we can do better next time is to sort of more be all on the same page about what we're doing, so that all teachers know what we're doing in advance. And if we're all rowing in the same direction, we're more likely to be able to address criticism when it comes. And if it has to target me rather than teachers, that's what it has to do, because I'm not running for office to sacrifice myself. But ultimately, our teachers are on the front lines, and they are doing the most important work. And so we have to be supportive of them. School board members, administrators, all of us have to be supportive of what our teachers are doing. Thank you.
I actually had a conversation about this recently with someone, and or a couple someones, and one of the things that occurred to me is that I think that as a board, we need to tackle this issue proactively and decide what it is that we're going to do if our teachers are threatened with licensure removal. What we're going to do to support them if they're receiving, harassing emails from parents. I don't know exactly what that answer is yet, because I need to talk to the attorneys or whatnot to figure out what we can do. But I'd like to say that we will take the heat, and that we will, I don't know if protect is the right word, but we will make sure teachers can do their jobs and the jobs that we as board members are asking them to do. I also think that part of that policy, that proactive policy, needs to include support for our teachers and administrators who are doing that work and might be getting harassed. I think that part of that is to do regular check-ins with them, to see what is going on. They also need to be able to refer this up the chain. It can't just be something that an individual teacher or even just a building principal has to deal with alone. I think that that's something that needs to be dealt with at the district office. And I think, frankly, maybe we need to set some boundaries and rules for how you can communicate with our school staff. If you use hateful language, then we will not respond to you. Let's apply some Facebook rules, I guess. I've never said that before.
I started.
Okay, so this is a good one. You ready? Yes. Okay, given the lack of diversity among school board candidates and among the board itself after the upcoming election, what work will you as candidates do to best represent families and students of color and immigrant families and students? How do you plan on furthering your education on their experiences and issues that impact them?
I think it's important for whichever of the three of us, or well, there's 7 of us, I guess. Yeah, I stand by my first statement. Whichever three of us get elected to the board, I think there's big work to do there, and I think we have 2 board members, and I didn't get to know the board member that moved away. But we have 2 board members now that you can't go to a board meeting without hearing them mention equity and talk about some of our marginalized students and populations here in Iowa, and talking about diversity. And it's not that our other board members aren't thinking that as well. I'm not saying that, but there's two. It seems like every board member leads the charge on something. We've got two that are getting off the board that have been leading that charge, and so to me, for us, those are big shoes to fill. I'm well aware of what I look like, and I am what I look like. I'm a 55-year-old white male. I get that. But I think my experiences in education and working with diverse populations and diverse students with various needs have put me in a position where I get what equity means. More importantly, I get what equity means behind the walls. And so I look forward to helping pick up that torch when those two board members are finished with their term. Thank you.
This is such an important question. I've spent a lot of time thinking about it myself. The year after college, I went and worked in Laredo, Texas, on the Texas-Mexico border as an AmeriCorps Vista volunteer. I spent a lot of time in immigrant communities, low-income immigrant communities, working with people, hanging out in houses that were very, very different from my own house, speaking mostly in Spanish most of the time. There was a day that I walked down to the Texas-Mexico border and stood there thinking about the difference in life experience between a child born where I was standing on the one side of the Rio Grande and a child standing on the other side of the Rio Grande. There's something about experiencing those kind of things that's really, really important. And that's why it's so important to have school board members of color, and that's why I'm sad that we won't. That said, I have spent a lot of time working in low-income and immigrant communities. That doesn't substitute for the experience of the school board members who are leaving. But what I can promise is that I will listen. I will go out into the community, because I have been going out into the community, and I will continue to go out into the community. This is something I care about. This is something that's critical to me as a person. I promise I will go out into the community, and I will listen. When you talk to me, I will try to respond. Thank you.
I think that, for me, this is something that I try to do in my job at ISU as well. As a professor, someone who teaches leadership studies and diversity classes, I chair our diversity committee in the journalism school. I'm very aware that I don't know everything. There's a lot that I don't know, but it's also my job to help clean it up. And I think that one of the ways that I do that is to listen. That's been mentioned, but I listen to students, I listen to faculty. I think Brett said something about just stop and listen. You had a more eloquent way of saying it. But I think that's very important. The other thing is I read a lot. I am a lifelong learner. And in my time at Iowa State, I have learned a lot about institutional racism. To be honest, I came here with certain ideas that have changed because I've listened and I've learned. In my time here, when I got here, I didn't understand why some folks were upset about the naming of the building. I have come to be actively opposed to the naming of that building. And a lot of that is because I stopped and said, wait a second. If people are upset about this, if people of color are saying this is a problem, then there's probably a problem there. So I need to listen and understand what that is, and that's the work that I'll do on the school board.
They've stolen all my answers.
It's a problem.
That is to say that I have so much respect for the other three people on the dais right now, and the conversations I've had with them individually and sometimes as a group. I know that any of us four getting those 3 seats will be valuable to this community. My answer is that experience, of course, is invaluable, but we can't experience everything. So I've written down in response to this question 3 words, and they're the same word: reading, reading, reading. I do a lot of it to try to broaden my understanding of this world when I haven't had those experiences. The most recent book I've read about diversity and about looking at our history and understanding it differently than I was taught it was a book called Caste by Isabel Wilkerson. Some of you may have read that book. I recommend it highly as a way to relook at things not through the prism of race, but through the prism of caste and that structure that's in our society today. The other word I've written 3 times is listening, listening, listening. And I'm glad Erica mentioned earlier the word collaboration, because when we're on the school board, it's not just us. We just have one vote. We're sitting there. But we've got each other to talk to. We've got study sessions to do. A number of us have attended school board meetings a lot in the last couple of months to get an idea of what might be required of us. And that's invaluable. So we don't just listen to the community. As important as that is, we'll listen to one another and the experiences that we bring to the board. And that's invaluable too for expanding our understanding and being able to work together and make decisions that are good ones.
All right, so we had a question, I would say it's a little similar to this last week, but I want to put a little, make sure that we have a focus on it. So it's one that came from the online, and I'm just going to read it as is. But fights have been numerous and discipline has been a major topic. What is your suggestion to Ames Community School District related to equity in discipline policies?
My turn? I thought you got started last time.
Yeah, I did.
Yeah, so the first part, so first, we need to be clear that addressing student behavior problems is not at odds with equity. We can do both. There has been a narrative at times in the community that these two things are at odds with each other, that we either address equity, that if you address equity, it means that you have like students wandering free in the hallways or something like this and no consequences and unsafe classrooms. That's not the case. Equity means that every child gets what they need to be safe and to learn and to thrive. And so that means that we have ways to keep all of our children safe in schools. So we need to think about this from the perspective of what is it that we can do to make sure that every single child in our schools is able to be safe and learn and thrive. So what does that mean? It means, first of all, that we address children that, first of all, we have to have consistently implemented standards and consequences for every child. So that's a very basic thing of behavior management. We also need, we need really basic people management strategies to address things in the schools. There are lots of really basic things that we can do that are going to improve behavior issues in the schools. We also need to be addressing kids' underlying issues. So mental health issues, poverty, other kinds of things that are affecting how children are behaving in the schools. And I'm out of time. Thank you.
I think first is to make sure that we have clear policy that is not, well, as much as possible, is not subjectively interpreted. I think that one of the problems that sometimes exists in discipline is that some people, whether teachers, staff, SROs, whoever they are, might interpret behavior by some students differently than by other students. So we have inconsistency in what behaviors are being disciplined. So I think that that needs to be an element to try to write policy that is as objective as possible. Now there's always some subjectivity. That means that we also need to adequately train staff. And staff, I mean administrators, teachers, everyone in the building, how to make sure that they are consistent and avoiding any sort of bias. I think we need accountability. I think that there needs to be data collected about disciplinary actions that are happening in every building so that we can monitor what's going on and if there is inequities and how discipline's being done, who's being interacted with, what consequences are being applied. And that's something that the board can review to ensure that that equity is being achieved. And then the last thing is, I said the last time that I think fights and disciplinary issues are often the symptom of a problem and not the problem itself. So that gets back to all of those other things we talked about related to climate and inclusion that create a space where people don't get in fights. There will always be some fights in high schools, right?
I've read the equity audit. It's fascinating to note that students with disabilities, Black students, and English language learning students receive detentions at a rate 3 times as high as what should be proportional for those groups in our schools. What's happening here? There is a difference in the way that perhaps administrators, SROs, and others are looking at these students, even teachers perhaps. We need to support all of these folks, but we need to engage in social emotional learning, not just for the students, but for all of us who are involved on the school board, teachers, administrators, everybody, to understand how we may be interpreting actions from one student because of their race or because of their gender or any other disability that we don't apply to the others. So that's important to note and to find out answers for that. Fighting is never acceptable. We need to find out the root causes though. I mean, of course, we're going to discipline, we're going to handle the ways of determining what to do with those students. But beyond that, let's look at the reasons that that fighting is occurring. What's occurring in the school climate, in the school environment, that is leading students to feel that that's their only way to express themselves? Certainly we need to be training students and all teachers and staff about, again, recognizing what our emotions are and how to express those adequately and appropriately.
Agree with most of what's been said here. With going to add a few things here. Your policies need to be clear and understood, but I wonder where the disconnect is with the students and where we see things happening right now. To me, in talking with one of my neighbors who has a son who's in the high school, and he said, what would you have done? He said, this happened today, what would you do tomorrow morning? He said, I would have a meeting with my entire student body in the high school gym. And we would have a discussion. What's going on? Why are we where we're at right now? Why would you not engage the students? Why would you not? And I'm not saying that didn't happen. Maybe it did. He asked what I would do. Engage the students. Say, what do you believe about safe schools? We have some students here tonight, or we did earlier. I don't know if they left or not. And asking them, what do you believe about a safe school? What's a safe school to you? How do we create it? And then give them ownership in it. You know what that means. We're going to have consequences. Yeah, we can all agree with that. We're going to need some consequences, Mr. Dreyer. Great. This is what those are going to look like. But here's what you also need to know. We're going to have a good conversation. I'm going to talk it through with you and your parents if you stub your toe. I'm going to be there with you. I'm going to support you. I'm still going to love you. You're probably going to go home if you're in a fight. The person who's on the other side of the fight is going to go home too, so they don't run into each other again, right? Common sense. One kid's going to come back, the other kid maybe has a longer suspension. But we're going to talk that through. You're going to know how we do things, and then we're going to bring you back into the fold when it's over with. But that post and that pre needs to happen along with the consequences. Thank you. You're doing a terrible job of sitting the stop sign. I need a larger stop sign, please.
All right, we will now allow each candidate 45 seconds to make a closing statement. I think it's Dr. Winfrey's turn.
45 seconds is hard. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight or watching online. I really appreciate the forum, and I hope that this is something that continues beyond this cycle. I'm running because I want to advocate for and partner with our community, with our students, and with our district staff. I am here because, in particular, because the topics we've talked about tonight are very important to me. We need to keep our district moving forward and keep making our school a better place to be. I will listen, I will learn, I will collaborate, I will work for you, but I'll also fight and I support some good trouble when necessary. And I hope that you give me the opportunity to serve on the board, and I ask for your vote on November 2nd. Thanks.
As I mentioned in my opening statement, equity in our schools is not optional. It is a requirement, and we all need to commit to it. If I'm on the board and I'm elected to the board, I promise and I commit that I will be an advocate for equity for all of our students. I mentioned collaboration a minute ago. For 30 years, I've worked with boards. I've been the pastor, they've been the board. I know what that takes. It's hard. It takes collaboration, communication, listening to one another completely, compromise, and finding ways forward based on everybody's experience. This would be flipped for me. I would be on the board, we'd have a superintendent, we didn't talk much about that tonight, but that person's vital to the program, but so are we, because we'll work with them and provide a vision that we can help and then support them as they carry it out. Vote Brett Becker on November 2nd.
A few things about schools. Don't believe it when someone tells you that things outside of school don't need to be addressed inside the school. Told you about the 8 hours, told you about the 10, 12 hours, we've all said it. Our kids are coming to us, we need to be ready to deal with everything. We are becoming an extension of parents. Whether we like that or not, we are, and we have been. In terms of just teaching the core, those days were dead about 50 years ago. We haven't just been teaching the core for a long time. If we were, we wouldn't have welders. Just as one example, and I could give you 50 million examples, okay? The most important job this school board is going to do is hire a superintendent. I've done that 3 times. I've been on a committee that hired a superintendent. The leadership matters, and this hiring of this superintendent is going to be hugely important. If you've been asked to be on one of those committees, please serve and let your voice be heard on that. Thank you.
So first of all, thank you to the Ames Youth School Action Team and the NAACP and the Anti-Racist Collaborative and the Black Liberation Movement for organizing this. And thanks to all of you for showing up. Showing up is the first step. So what are the next steps? The very next step is to go vote. And if you'd like, you could vote for me. Beyond that, please keep coming back. We need to keep this conversation going. If I'm elected to the Ames Community School Board, I want you to keep bugging me. Please keep bugging me. Yes, hi, thank you. I look forward to being bugged by you. We need to keep talking about this. These issues, I want to be a voice in the community to hear what you all have to say, and we can address these issues together. Thank you.
All right, this concludes the inaugural Ames Diversity, Equity, Inclusion School Board Candidate Forum. As was mentioned, please go vote in the election on Tuesday, November 2nd. If you're not registered, there's an opportunity to do so in that. Good luck to all our candidates. Thank you for being here. Thank you for this conversation. Good night.